Today, I'll delve into the combination of Home Assistant and WLED. I'll cover the integration process, the device and entities created in Home Assistant, and how you can use these entities on a dashboard or in your automations and scripts. I'll also cover how adding segments to your WLED project can provide even more control and automation possibilities, showing a couple real-world examples that I use in my home. Finally, I'll cover advanced integration options using the WLED JSON API and the Home Assistant RESTful command. Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. I've done a lot of LED videos here on my channel, including ones on how to build your own WLED controller, how to wire and connect peripherals to that controller, and even one on how to create and use segments in WLED. I'll throw some links to these prior videos up here on the screen and down in the video description, but for this video I'm going to assume you already know how to properly build and wire a WLED display. If not, check out a couple of these other videos first. The video description will also have links to any parts that I show or use. And let's start out by taking a look at some of the hardware I will be using for this video. Here's a basic WLED controller created on a breadboard. Now, even if you've never built your own device before, you can build one of these in about 15 minutes or less with only a handful of parts and no soldering. It does utilize an ESP32. Yes, WLED still supports the ESP8266, but the ESP32 is now recommended for all new builds, so that's what I'll be using here. There's also an optional logic level shifter that may be necessary in certain situations where the controller is located some distance away from the start of the LED strip. And I've covered the use of these logic level shifters in numerous other videos, but do note that I no longer recommend the use of these I2C compatible shifters in my builds, and instead recommend that you use a quad bus buffer gate shifter. Now, if you want to know why, you can check out my mea culpa video, but note that some of my older videos will still show this I2C type shifter, and they've worked out well for me in the past, but is no longer the preferred shifter. For a quick bench test, I've connected the controller to a short strip of WS2812B 5V RGB LEDs. The latest WLED, which is currently version 0.15, was installed on the ESP32 using the web installer. And as you can see from a very quick bench test here, my controller and my LED strips seem to be working just fine. To better show the use of things like segments, I need something more than a short strip of LEDs, so I'm going to use a test version of my matrix clock that also has a secondary WLED controller. Now, in addition to a dedicated LED controller for the clock, scoreboard, and other features, it uses a standard WLED controller similar to the breadboard version I just showed, and it is attached to 400 LEDs. Now, note that the LEDs are actually one long string of LEDs wired in a serpentine fashion, which you can kind of see from the effect here. But do note that a matrix layout is not required for what I'm going to cover. Everything I do will work with linear runs of LED strips as well, and I'll show a couple examples of linear runs in a bit. I'm only using a matrix here because it's a little bit easier to show here on camera as opposed to a long straight run of up to 400 LEDs. And also note that while I'm using 5V WS2812B LEDs, any type of LED strip supported by WLED can be used. Here's the standard WLED interface. Again, I cover many parts of this in other videos, so I'm only going to provide a brief overview to a few features as they relate to the Home Assistant integration. First up are presets. Now, I've already created a handful of presets for this controller. Preset is simply a saved configuration that includes things like the current color, brightness, and effect, and other settings. I also have a couple of playlists defined here. Now, a playlist is simply a list of those presets in a certain order where you can specify the duration and the transition for those. So there are presets and then playlists which are made out of presets. When it comes to segments, WLED will automatically create a default or segment 0 that consists of the entire length of the LED strip, in this case 400 LEDs. Anytime I apply a color or any type of effect, it applies to the whole strip. However, we can divide up a run of LEDs into segments or portions of the LED strip that can be controlled individually. Here I've divided my LED strip into 4 equal segments of 100 LEDs each, or 4 rows on the matrix. Now, do note that the starting LED is 0 base, so it starts with 0, but the stop LED is not included in the segment. So this is not 101 LEDs, it's actually just 100 LEDs, the next segment starts with that 100 and would actually go up to 199. But once I have my 4 segments defined, I can now select a segment and do things like apply a different color to each individual segment. Or I could even come in here and do something like apply an effect to one of those segments. And optionally, I can also go back and I can once again select all 4 segments, which makes it be treated like a single LED strip. And then any effect or color I apply is going to apply to the entire strip. Let me show you a couple of examples where I use segments with a linear LED display. With my LED stair lighting project, I can run any of the built-in effects or colors that WLED offers. By creating segments, it gives me the ability to turn each individual segment off and on along this entire strip. And again, I can also control this as one single strip. Or just like before, each individual segment can have its own color and even have its own effect if that's what you want. And here in the kitchen, I have under cabinet LEDs, which once again can be controlled as an entire strip, or because I've defined 3 different segments for these LEDs, I can control each of those 3 segments independently, including having a different color or a different effect. I'll come back to this to show you how I take advantage of this in an automation in a bit. On the Home Assistant side, there is an officially supported WLED integration. Once a WLED device is added to the same network as Home Assistant, it should automatically be discovered and can be found under Settings, Devices, and Services. Simply click Add, and it will automatically be added to Home Assistant. But if the device isn't discovered for some reason, like MDNS is blocked on your network, you can manually add a device by clicking Add Integration, search for WLED, select it, and then it's going to prompt you for the IP address of your controller. Don't know the IP address for your new WLED device? Well, you can normally find it using your router, but here's another little quick tip to get the IP address. Reconnect the ESP32 board to your computer and return to the WLED web installation site. Go ahead and click Install and reconnect to the proper COM port. Since WLED is already installed on here, it detects that and gives you an option to visit device. Go ahead and click that, and note right up here in the address bar, you will find the IP address for your controller. In addition, you can also go to Config, Wi-Fi Setup, scroll down, and you will find the IP address here as well. Now that you know the IP address, you can manually add it via the WLED integration here in Home Assistant. Now normally, future devices will be automatically discovered, again, unless you have network settings that prevent it, but you can always manually add WLED controllers via the IP address in this manner. Once the WLED controller has been added, you will find a new device in Home Assistant. And this device contains all of the related entities that you can use on dashboards or for scripts and automations. Now, the entities that are initially created will depend somewhat upon the setup and configuration that you did on the WLED side. Here I have the WLED configuration and the Home Assistant device configuration for my WLED basement desk install. Now note that I haven't defined any segments here. I just have the default master segment that includes the entire LED strip. Over on the Home Assistant side, that means I get a single light entity that I can use to simply turn the LEDs on and back off again. Also notice I have a number of presets here, and those presets are automatically populated right here into the Home Assistant interface. I can simply select one of these and again change and apply presets to anything that I want. Now in my particular case, I don't have any playlists defined over here, so note that the playlist is currently disabled. As soon as I define a playlist, then that would be available in here as well. In addition to the light, playlist, and preset entities, a number of other entities are created as well. This includes things like the color palette, the intensity of the brightness, and the speed. And since I only have one segment defined up here for WLED, when I make changes to these items, it's going to impact the entire LED strip. Note that if desired, I can actually add these entity sections directly to a dashboard by clicking the Add to Dashboard, and I simply select the page of the dashboard that I want them to be added to. Then it's going to come up with a recommended card. I could pick a different card. I'm actually just going to accept the original. It will add that to my dashboard, and then I can repeat this for the additional sections if I also wish to include those on my dashboard. Now with these entities here on a dashboard, it gives me full control of my LED display right here within Home Assistant, and I can do all the things that I would normally do through the WLED interface. Of course, I could go in and I could now edit these and modify them, or I could even add the entities manually onto a dashboard if desired. But this does give you a quick starting point of the way to get all of those entities from WLED directly onto a dashboard. Of course, you can do more with these entities other than just display them on a dashboard. You can use them in your automations and scripts. Here are the entities created when integrating a WLED controller that has only a single segment. Of course, your entity names will be different. I'm just using a generic WLED for the device name. The main light entity is used to turn the LEDs on or off. But note that when you use the light turn on service in the action of an automation or script, you can also specify other starting values like color, brightness, or intensity, the effects, and more. You can also see the YAML equivalent here on the right for those of us that are still using old school YAML for our automations and scripts. Of course, you can use these other entities to modify the LEDs in your automations. Here, for example, are the actions for one of my stair light automations. You can see that I'm setting the effect speed by setting the number speed entity. I then turn the switch on to reverse the effect direction. This allows me to control whether the lights are running up or down the stairs. So the automation for the top of the stairs turns this reverse switch on, but the automation for the bottom of the stairs turns this switch back off. Finally, I turn on the LEDs with the speed and direction already set, but I also include the brightness, color, and effect in this action. Note that instead of specifying speed, direction, color, and brightness independently, I could create a preset with all those settings and simply set the value of the preset select entity to the appropriate preset name. This is probably the better way, but when I created my stair lights a number of years ago, presets from WLED were not available in Home Assistant. Regardless, these entities give you a lot of control over the LEDs, but where it gets really interesting is when you create multiple segments for one of your LED displays. Here I'm back to my kitchen cabinets where I've created those 2 additional segments for a total of 3. So what happens when this device is integrated into Home Assistant? When more than one segment is defined in WLED, on the Home Assistant side, additional entities are created. First, an additional light entity is created for each segment. This allows you to toggle each segment on or off individually. Now, by default, a main entity is created, which applies to the entire strip, like if you have a single segment. What's more, each segment also has its own entities for things like intensity or brightness, speed, color palette, and that reverse switch. And since an effect is defined as part of the light turn on service, each segment can also have its own effect. This gives you total control of the display via Home Assistant. Not only on a dashboard where we can create controls for each segment, we can use all of these entities in automations and scripts. Let's take a peek at one way that I use segments in automations for my kitchen cabinet lights. Here's just one example of how I can use segments in an automation in Home Assistant. Recall these kitchen cabinet lights had 3 different segments. Now, the way that they normally operate is that if the overhead lights are on and it's before 11 p.m. and presence is detected over here by the counters, then these lights will automatically come on, and as soon as you leave the detected zone, those lights will simply turn themselves back off again. But if the overhead lights are off and it's after 11 p.m. and then presence is detected in this particular area, then what happens is just the single segment gets turned on at a much lower brightness or intensity, so it more or less serves as a night light. And again, when presence is no longer detected in that area, the lights simply turn themselves back off again. So it's just one example of how you can use segments in your Home Assistant automations. And here is the action part of that automation that I just showed. Now again, the trigger can be anything that you want. It could be motion detection, it could be presence detection, it could be based on some other type of event that happens, but this is the action that runs. In my case, the first thing I've done is I've added an if-then-else block within my actions. And what I'm saying is if it's after 11 p.m. and my main overhead kitchen lights are off, then I want to turn on just a single segment of that LED strip. I'm going to set it to a very warm white color and a brightness level of just 10%. However, if it's before 11 p.m. or the main overhead kitchen lights are on, then I want to turn on the entire strip, and that would be that main segment. In my case, I've happened to rename that here, but I'm going to set it to a full white at a brightness level of 75%. So in my case, this one automation is going to control whether the full LED strip is turned on at a bright level or a single segment is turned on at a dim level, like for a night light. And this is just one simple example of how you can use segments with your LED display. Now here's the action part of the automation that I showed as a demo for my stair lights earlier. And sorry, I'm just showing the YAML here, but the logic is pretty easy to recreate in the UI editor. In this particular case, I'm simply turning on the first segment at the top in my particular instance, and I'm setting it to solid red. I then delay for a half second. Then I turn on the next segment, in this case, white. I again delay for 500 milliseconds and then turn on the next segment in blue, and so on until all the segments are lit. Now, if I want these segments to light up from the bottom up, all I've got to do is simply reverse the order of the segments in this automation. Now, this is a pretty simple example, but it does show another way of how segments can be used as part of a longer linear WLED installation. Now, while this list doesn't include every possible action or option for interfacing with WLED, these are some of the more common ones you're likely to use in your automations or scripts. I've already shown the light control options, and again, in addition to turn on, there is a turn off and a toggle. But in the turn on action, you can also optionally include things like brightness, speed, color, and effect. And I showed that in one of my previous examples. But outside of that, you can actually set the brightness independently by finding the number entity for the intensity of your WLED and setting it to the desired value. The same thing for speed. Again, that is a number entity, and we can just set a value. And this is that reverse switch, so we can turn this switch on or back off again to reverse the effect. Now, obviously, that's going to be dependent upon the effect you have selected. If you have something like solid, then the reverse switch is going to have no effect. And of course, all four of these particular actions can be used with individual segments if you have those defined in your WLED controller. In addition to these, you can also select and launch a particular preset or playlist by finding the select entity for the preset or playlist of your WLED controller and then specifying the actual name of the preset or playlist in the data section. Still not enough control? What if you need to interact with WLED and an action isn't available via the integrated entities? Well, you can use the WLED JSON API and a Home Assistant RESTful command for additional control and options. WLED offers a JSON API that can be called from any external system, including Home Assistant. This API offers a long list of commands, options, and states that can be used for the rare situations where you want to automate some action and it isn't available via the normal entities. These commands are sent as a special JSON payload to a special URL of the WLED controller. So how do you use this API from Home Assistant? For that, we can use a RESTful command. Now, I'm not going to go in depth regarding Home Assistant REST commands in this video, but they can be used to post or get data from a device's URL-based API. In this case, I'm going to post data to the IP address of my WLED controller to a special JSON/state URL. Now, the payload is delivered in a JSON format per the documentation, and in this particular example, I'm turning on my LEDs, I'm setting a brightness level, and then I'm selecting a random preset between presets number 2 and 6. As a little side note, did you know you can simply append JSON to the IP address for your WLED controller in a browser to return the complete state of the controller in JSON format? And if your browser offers it, you can click this little pretty print button, or you can simply copy and paste the raw JSON string into a utility to reformat the payload and see how the JSON is structured. This can help to structure your own payload in the Home Assistant REST command. And yes, you could use a RESTful command to return this entire JSON payload into a variable in Home Assistant. You could then parse out the JSON to get substantially more information about the state of the WLED display versus what you normally get from the created entities. So once you've created the desired REST command in Home Assistant, you can then call that command from an action section of an automation or script. Now, in most cases, you'll likely be able to use the WLED integrated entities, but just note that the full WLED JSON API is available from Home Assistant if needed for advanced or special corner cases. So the Home Assistant WLED integration provides a lot of local control for your LED displays in Home Assistant that you can show on a dashboard or use in automations and scripts. And even if something isn't available, you can probably use the advanced options of the WLED JSON API to get even more control for your automations and scripts. And I haven't even touched the surface on doing things like adding peripherals or other components to your WLED controller that can also be integrated and used in Home Assistant. But hopefully I've inspired a few ideas on how you might use Home Assistant and WLED together in your own smart home projects. I'll be back soon with more videos on DIY electronics, LEDs, and Home Assistant. But until that time, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.